Well, there's a lot of slides, 29 that went before this slide. So let me see if I can just sum up what we've covered thus far. And what I want to do is I want to read you a paragraph out of a book by James Leo Garrett. James Leo Garrett was a professor of mine back in the 90s, and well, I would call him a friend. We didn't spend time together, but whenever I went back to the campus, he knew my name. That was always encouraging, and we would speak from time to time in his office. And he's a good brother, and he went on to be with the Lord several years ago. But he did, before he died, publish his work on Baptist theology. It's a kind of a look at 400 years of Baptist doctrine. And in it, he has a summary statement about the downgrade controversy that Spurgeon was involved in. After speaking about some controversies going on, and I apologize for my voice today. I don't know what's happening. I've cut back from 3 packs to 2 packs a day, and I don't know what the problem is, but I've got this thing, and yeah, you're probably going to be singing by yourselves today in church, but we'll see what happens. After spending some time talking about controversies in America regarding doctrinal compromise, he comes over the pond again to England and says at the same time, this is in the latter years of the 19th century, among the English Baptists, the downgrade controversy saw C.H. Spurgeon and John Clifford. Remember, John Clifford was the secretary of the Baptist Union. We talked about him in the past few weeks. They were on opposite sides of an issue in this downgrade controversy. Spurgeon, who out of a Congregationalist family had become a Baptist by choice, was the boy preacher who at 19 had taken the pulpit of Keach, Gill, and Ripon and built up Britain's great megachurch. An evangelical Calvinist and an heir of the Puritan heritage, Spurgeon had had his clashes with high Calvinists and high Calvinist fellow Baptist pastors and with Anglicans over baptismal regeneration. We had mentioned over the last few weeks that for the first 20, 30 years or so of his ministry there in England, there were multiple controversies that he was engaged in, leaving the final controversy in the late 80s, early 90s to the downgrade controversy. And 2 of those early controversies were with the high or the hyper-Calvinists in the London churches principally. They thought Spurgeon preached too much like an Arminian, and he was too animated, he was too engaging, he was too funny at times. They didn't like that. I don't think he held still in the pulpit. I think he moved a lot. I remember when I first started preaching back in the early 90s, my grandmother came to visit me one time, who has since gone to be with the Lord, and she said, "You don't walk around when you preach, do you?" "No, Grandma, I hold still." And so she didn't want anybody moving anywhere when they were preaching. You should just stand still. And so fortunately, that kind of went with my mentality anyway. But Spurgeon was just too much, they thought, of an Arminian. And so he had a lot of controversies with the high Calvinists. But then he also wrote some things against the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and their views of baptismal regeneration. And that got him in trouble as well. Ultimately, Garrett says, he came to suspect that among Baptists and other nonconformists, there were those who were embracing heresies such as the denial of biblical inspiration and inerrancy, or of substitutionary atonement, and the affirmation of the universal fatherhood of God. Those of you men who are involved in the book study by Machen that we're doing right now will recognize some of those doctrines as tantamount to modernism and liberalism. Also, some he found embracing Darwinian evolution or eschatological universalism, and that's a big word meaning that all are saved in the end time, all right? Clifford, on the other hand, a general Baptist pastor in London, had earned university degrees and embraced historical critical methods, evolution, and the new theology. The public controversy set off by articles in Spurgeon's The Sword and the Trowel, and those are the articles that we mentioned by Schindler, we looked at several quotes there, was not handled well by the leadership of the Baptist Union and encumbered by the promise of confidentiality and correspondence. He's alluding here to the letters. We talked about letters between Spurgeon and Booth, the president of the union, and Culross, the outgoing secretary of the Baptist Union. So those were letters that were written by Spurgeon and these other men in the union prior to the outbreak of the controversy in 1887. And when the controversy did break out, these guys were like, radio silent, crickets. They're not going to support Spurgeon at all. So Spurgeon ultimately resigns from the Baptist Union, but led no schism from the union. There would have been a few people that broke away, but for the most part, churches stayed within the Baptist Union. All right? Now, for the next 4 years, though, Spurgeon does continue to speak against the Baptist Union. He does continue to kind of raise the flag, if you will, of alarm against those who are compromising. But eventually, he dies an early death in 1892. Now, before we talk about that just a little bit, questions kind of up to this point. We've just covered 30 slides in 5 minutes. So you're thinking, why did it take 2 weeks to do that then? So anyway, all right. Okay. Well, let's talk about the nail in the coffin, and this is the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. This is about the death of Spurgeon. By the time 1892 came around, Spurgeon had withdrawn to Menton, France once again. And while he was there on retreat, trying to recover his physical health, this is where Spurgeon passes away. And he made the comment, he was standing on the train platform before they boarded the train to depart from London. And then I would imagine they took a boat. They would have had to take a boat, I guess, at that point in time to get to France. But he made the comment to someone before leaving. He said, "The fight is killing me." And his wife, upon his death, wrote in his autobiography, in fact, it was the Downgrade Controversy that ended up taking his life. He faced a lot of struggles his whole life long. But it seemed, physically speaking, gout, various different struggles he had. He was not a healthy man. He was kind of a short, chubby fellow. He didn't have a real strong constitution in that sense, which is an amazing thing to think about when you really consider all the things Spurgeon did. If you ever just want to be amazed, get Arnold Dallamore's biography on Charles Spurgeon. It's about 220 pages. It's not very long, but it is amazing. There's the wonderful 2-volume biography that Banner of Truth puts out. Dallamore has a 1-volume small biography of him. Lewis Drummond has a biography on Spurgeon called The Prince of Preachers. It's very good. And one of the things that Drummond's has, and this sounds almost trite, but there's lots of pictures. And what I mean by that is actual photograph pictures of the tabernacle of Spurgeon, and it's quite an encouraging book to look through. And Drummond's a very good writer. But this is what Spurgeon said October the 26th, 1891, when he was departing. "The fight is killing me." And in fact, it did. This is an actual picture of the procession of Spurgeon. I don't know how clear it comes out there, but I found several artistic representations of the procession, but this was an actual photograph, and I thought it was quite impressive. Thousands and thousands turned out for his funeral as they drove the carriage through the streets of London. Upon his death, the Prime Minister of England wrote a letter of condolence to Susanna Spurgeon. And I didn't have a copy of that, but I've heard it read, and it's quite profound that the prime minister, who would have been an Anglican, I'm sure, took time to write the wife of a Baptist preacher who passed away. So I want to talk for a few moments today about lessons that we learn from the downgrade. Before I do that, any questions or comments about his death? Or yeah, Andrew. Yeah, we'll talk to you later. And so, Ben, do you have a real question? I'm just kidding.
I know that he was some sort of doctrinal statement.
Right.
And that's kind of where it ended. But getting more desperate.
Mm-hmm.
Where did it start? Did it have a desire for the Baptist?
No, he did not. That was not something that was pushed. In, I think, 1854, he did republish, or 55, he did republish the Second London Confession of Faith for his own church, and probably promoted that through the college and with the young men that went out to plant churches that came through the pastor's college. But no, he never made the Second London itself the doctrinal standard that he was going to press upon the Baptist Union. I think he would have been happy to have gone back to what it was in the 30s. If you recall, in 1813, when the Baptist Union began, the Second London Confession was the standard confession of the churches that united together. And then in the 1830s, they made the shift, and they just adopted a statement of evangelical convictions, and that would have been a much briefer statement, all right? And then it was in the 70s that they came and said, well, the only thing we want to have is baptism, all right? And then the declaratory statement that came out in 1888, that was after his removal from, or after he left the Union, and the way they framed the declaratory statement that we read last week together, he's like, this is pointless. This is like a doctrinal statement with no teeth, and you're not going to make it the basis of the Union. I think if they had done that declaratory statement without the caveats and actually made the declaratory statement the basis of union, he might have contemplated coming back. But I still don't know if he would have. So yeah, the Second London it wasn't that kind of an issue. It wasn't like pressing for this kind of a thing. He knew that would never fly. But keep in mind, when he came in the 1850s, the Union was united by virtue of the evangelical convictions. And he's very embroiled in other controversies for 20, 30 years. And by the time the 70s rolled around, the 80s, he realizes how compromised the Union has become. And so to push for the Second London never would have flown. But he thought maybe evangelical convictions, maybe that'll fly. And I think that would have been enough for him. So, all right, anything else? Okay, well, let's talk about a few lessons learned. And I only have like 3 that I want to kind of focus on, all right? And these are lessons kind of for us as a church, for our churches as associations of churches, all right? Number 1, I think our unions must be based on shared commitment to truth expressed in our creeds and in our confessions. This is one of the things that Spurgeon was really trying to argue for, that the creeds and confessions, or the evangelical, truncated statement that they came up with in the Baptist Union, that would serve as the basis for the Union. Now, keep in mind, many of the churches in the Baptist Union in the 1880s, 1890s, probably into the early 20th century, were evangelically minded churches. It's not that the heresies that Spurgeon was decrying were widespread and pervasive and nobody believes in the Trinity, everybody's an Arian or a Socinian, or everybody's a universalist. He wasn't saying that. What he was saying is that the strength of the union is weakening because we don't use the doctrines that we do affirm as any kind of basis, any kind of litmus test, any kind of requirement that you have to hold these things to be in this association. This particular quotation is taken from B.H. Carroll, who was the founding president of Southwestern Seminary in 1908 here in Fort Worth. And he made this comment that was very applicable to Baptists in America. He said, "A church with a little creed is a church with a little life. The more divine doctrines a church can agree on, the greater its power and the wider its usefulness. The fewer its articles of faith, the fewer its bonds of union and compactness. The modern cry, less creed and more liberty, is a degeneration from the vertebrate to the jellyfish." I love that. And means less unity and less morality. And it means more heresy. Definitive truth does not create heresy. It only exposes and corrects. Shut off the creed, and the Christian world will fill up with heresy, unsuspected and uncorrected, but none the less deadly. This is true in the early 20th century. It's true today. When you find a church or a group of churches that is intent on lowering the bar so more and more people can get in, let's have more people, let's have more money, let's have more prosperity, what you end up having is a weaker organization in the long run. I've got a couple of books I wanted to recommend to you. One is this book we've mentioned a couple times by Greg Wills. Greg Wills is a professor at Southern Seminary, and the book he's written is called Democratic Religion, and the subtitle is Freedom, Authority, and Church Discipline in the Baptist South, 1785 to 1900. And you're thinking, I've been needing some sleeping material. This might be it. This could probably do it. I don't need to take, melatonin or whatever those things are. What's the thing you take for, is it melatonin? Is that complete? Yeah, okay. This might do it too, all right? But it's really good. What he does in this book is he chronicles Baptist life, principally Southern Baptist life, in the South in Georgia. He focuses in on Georgia, and he shows the shifts and the change on issues like biblical authority, confessionalism, Calvinism, creedalism, and the embrace of confessions and church discipline in the South in those years. He focuses in on what it was like in the Baptist South right before the Civil War and what it was like after the Civil War. And he shows the shifts and the changes that took place, the weakening of the doctrinal fidelity, the weakening of church discipline, and the weakening of biblical authority in the churches. And this leads to the encroachments of modernism, liberalism to come into the Baptist churches in the South just at the same time they're happening over in England. And this leads to the modernism and liberalism in Baptist life and congregational life as a whole, church life as a whole in the early 20th century. So if you keep in mind, again, the book we're reading by Machen, some of you guys, Machen's a what? He's not a Baptist. He's a Presbyterian, all right? So the same thing happening with the Baptists is happening with the Presbyterians, all right? We want to make it easier for people to get in. We want them to stay. We want it to flourish. So let's open up the door a little bit wider. There's an interesting story of what happens in the Northern Baptist Convention in the 1920s, and it's just another example of this same kind of thing. There is a man who is the pastor of the Park Avenue Church in New York City. Ironically, his name is Cornelius Wolfkin. All right? You got a guy who's a minister, and his last name is Wolfkin. you should probably be suspicious, all right? At the Northern Baptist Convention, and I'm trying to find the year, I think it's in 1922, at the Northern Baptist Convention, they were going back and forth about whether or not they should have a confessional statement or not for the Northern Baptist Convention. Now, this is 3 years before the Southern Baptist Convention adopts its first official doctrinal statement, its first confession of faith in 1925, called the Baptist Faith and Message, right? For all the things that the Baptist Faith and Message lacks, at least in 1925, the Southern Baptists tried, all right? But in 1922, the Northern Baptist Convention has this debate, and Wolfkin stands up and offers a substitute motion to the one that was on the floor already of adopting a confession of faith. And the substitute motion stated that, quote, the Northern Baptist Convention affirms that the New Testament is the all-sufficient ground of our faith and practice, and we need no other statement. Get that. Wolfkin's motion prevailed by a vote of 1,264 to 637. And probably today you haven't even heard of the Northern Baptist Convention. I don't know where a Northern Baptist Convention church is. There may be one somewhere. It's probably split several times since then. All that to say, what was going on in the Downgrade Controversy is happening in America in the South. It's happening later in America in the Northern Baptist Convention. It is happening in the movements of Machen, and it's happened in the Southern Baptist Convention several times since then. The Southern Baptist Convention itself was well on the road to liberalism, if not neo-orthodoxy, in the 1960s and the 70s. And in 1979, they appointed their first president that affirmed the inerrancy of Scripture. That was Adrian Rogers in what's known as the conservative resurgence. So for all the problems the Southern Baptist Convention has, and it has many, the Southern Baptist Convention today is not what it was in the 1970s. I remember going to seminary in the early 1990s at Southwestern. It was terrifying to go there. It was like barely hanging on to be a Christian institution. And it was just the classes I went to, the things I was told by professors and students were just terrifying. But so that confessionalism, that creedalism, if our unions are not based upon a shared commitment to those things, our associations will weaken and eventually die. A second lesson, or any comments about that? Questions, thoughts? Yeah, man. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. The other book is, I think I might have posted this week. It's written by Samuel Miller, The Utility and Importance of Creeds and Confessions. I got a copy of this week. I've heard about this book. I've read some stuff by Samuel Miller in the past. Samuel Miller is connected with the founding of Princeton Seminary back in the 19th century. And the Presbyterians themselves in the 19th century, it doesn't wait for Machen in the early 20th century. In the 19th century, the Presbyterians were embroiled in a controversy over the issue of to what extent are their confessions. They had their confession. They've got the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Shorter Catechism, the Larger Catechism, the Directory of Public Worship. So they had their confessions and creeds. But to what extent were these going to be used as this basis for union? Or to what extent were they going to require ministers to affirm the doctrines that were contained in their confessions, in their catechism? There was a man by the name, I think his name is Duncan, and I wanted to read a statement that Duncan made here. Yeah. Try to find the year for us. This is 1824, and Duncan, who is he's a professor. I'm not sure exactly where. Okay. In 1821, Duncan is a minister of the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, and he is connected to the board of directors for Princeton Seminary. And Duncan makes the comment in the 1820s here. Pleading for ministerial liberty, all right? If you've ever been in a Christian academic institute, but I think they would have this just in any kind of institute, any kind of college or university setting, they'll speak about things like academic liberty, all right? Or the liberty of professors to maybe, do study and come up to conclusions and even espouse their views if they're even counter to the institution. It's just a matter of academic freedom, all right, that they would be able to say and speak their piece. Professors don't like to have like one arm, tied behind their back type thing, all right? Or they don't want to have their mouths taped shut. They want to be able to speak their thoughts, right? So to what extent an academic institution wants to give them that academic freedom, that's often a debate and discussion. Duncan makes the comment, he said, our fifth general proposition, this is in this document, A Plea for Ministerial Liberty. He says, our fifth general proposition is that the minister of the gospel should consider his Bible as the only document which is or can be commensurate with his commission, and should study it believingly and prayerfully as the only method by which he can acquire true ministerial literature. In other words, no creed, no confession, no statement of faith of the institution is going to stand over the professor or the minister, all right? He's going to have this academic freedom, this liberty. The Bible is the only document. Now, that statement itself, Miller said at that meeting, prompted little offense. Yet, he goes on, Duncan did, to explain himself and what he meant. Duncan twisted the knife, Miller said, which he had most certainly plunged into the bosom of the Princetonians. Here's what Duncan said. We all know that every age has its own classification of what it apprehends to be scriptural truths. All of our religious sects have their own classifications of what they suppose to be scriptural doctrines. The matters which now startle Christians and Christian ministers into activity and thrill every nerve of the ecclesiastical body are Calvinism, Arminianism, Hopkinsianism. That's a good one, all right? Hopkins was a guy who took the theology of Jonathan Edwards and kind of made some modifications and ended up promoting what was often called the New England theology that had its interesting issues. That's for another day. And other such like gorgeous fragments of Christ's spiritual kingdom. To me, it is of the purest astonishment to hear Christian ministers talk so untenderly about the Bible and speak so affectionately and feelingly about their own standards. All right? Standards, the meaning of which they have never yet settled, and about which there has been incessant controversy, both in public and private. They surely can never have fairly thought out what they say or suffered themselves to apprehend the immense difference between the Word of God and the doctrines of men, simply as exercising an efficient control over consciences and lives of mankind. What's he trying to say here? He's saying that all these different doctrinal issues, they've never really been settled. People are still arguing about them. So why make those the standard? Let's just make the Bible the standard, as if nobody ever argued about the Bible, right? So, anyway, this book chronicles that debate, chronicles that discussion. Miller is espousing, is trying to promote the idea that the doctrinal standards of the Presbyterian Church in America should be upheld, they should be affirmed by ministers, and it shouldn't be done, you shouldn't affirm the doctrinal standards of an association, of a convention of churches with your fingers crossed behind your back. I remember R.C. Sproul saying several years ago that when he was like being examined by the presbytery or the group that was going to license them, there was a young man sitting outside with him, and they were talking, and I probably got this story a little mixed up, but they were talking, and Sproul knew that the guy beside him didn't affirm the documents, the standards of the Presbyterian Church. And he asked the guy when he came out, "What did you say when they asked you?" "Well, I just lied." "Okay." And he got his church. You just lie. I had a guy, I think I've mentioned this story before, back in 2004 to 2009, I was in the Air Force Reserves as a chaplain. And I went to a chaplain school, I think it was like 2008, out in Alabama. And there were like 17 of us in the class, and we were having dinner one night, and we were sitting there talking, and guy across the table from me, we started to talk about his connections, who he was endorsed by. He was endorsed by the Presbyterian Church. I think it was probably the PCUSA. And it's a rather liberal wing of the Presbyterians. And so we began to talk about, I said, "Oh, so you guys have like the Westminster Confession of Faith?" He said, yeah, we've got that, and the catechisms, and the Directory of Public Worship, and stuff like that. I said, "Wow, that's great." He said, "Yeah, well, we don't really believe them." I was just like, I was getting so excited, and then I was like deflated. It's like, you just got endorsed by an organization that doesn't even believe its statement of faith. So, your endorsement, it's like a wet Kleenex. What worth and what value is your endorsement? What kind of a chaplain are you going to be? Well, just a Christian chaplain that doesn't believe his own doctrinal standards. Well, our unions, I believe, must be based upon a shared commitment to truth expressed in our creeds and confessions. Secondly, our unions must be unions of churches and not simply persons or personalities. Now, the reason I mention this is because I don't know what was going on in the ecclesiology that was kind of feeding the Baptist Union, but you could join the Baptist Union as a person. Your church didn't have to be connected to the Baptist Union for you to be in the Baptist Union, all right? So your church could join the union, all right? But then the question is, what kind of union is it? It's not a union of an association of churches. It's a union of persons. Now, some of these persons happen to be connected to a church, and the church actually is a part of that as well. We have this as well today. We have some networks of even Reformed Baptist churches that you don't have to be a member of a church to join it. You can just join it by yourself. I remember back in the late 90s, early 2000s, back in Faith Community days, we had a guy come to our church who was a missionary who was endorsed by a group called FIRE. You ever heard of FIRE? The Fellowship of Independent Reformed Evangelicals, all right? It's almost like every word in the title counters the other word. It's a fellowship of independent, so it's not an association. Fellowship is supposed to encourage the idea of we're together. Fellowship of independent, jumbo shrimp, drove by Wendy's one time years ago and I noticed it. Giant quarter pounder burger. I thought, is that bigger than the regular quarter pounder burger? I want the giant quarter pounder burger. I mean, if I can get that one, is it? Anyway, sorry. Fellowship of Independent Reformed. Nothing historically about the Reformed tradition is just a fellowship or independency. Independency and Reform don't go together. Of evangelicals. The whole evangelical movement, the 20th century, was not Reformed. Ryan, can you imagine R. Scott Clark having a problem with the title, Fellowship of Independent Reformed? I don't know. Of course, he has a problem with us too, but it's...
There used to be a very big group.
Right. Right. And there are a lot of well-meaning guys, I'm sure, but it could just be called Calvinistic-y friends. You know, but it's called fire. That sounds exciting, all right? And we had this guy come, and he wanted us to get connected with fire. And we had a guy come to the church who had been connected with fire, and a guy that joined our church who was actually a member of fire. Okay, so it's just a fellowship of evangelical people. It's not a connection of churches at all right? We have the RBN, the Reformed Baptist Network today. For the most part, Second London Confession Group. However, it's not a full subscription group, so you don't have to affirm the whole of the confession. And if you're in a church that, if you affirm these things generally, you can join. It's not an association of churches. It's, as we historically know, associations. And in the 19th century, the Baptist Union was not historic associationalism. It was a union of churches and persons. And then I say here, even personalities, all right? And Spurgeon, maybe to no fault of his own necessarily, was a personality. I mean, he was a giant figure in the sense that many were part of the union because he was part of the union. And this is why it was so shocking to people when he left the union that not many left. Our own confession says in 26:14, as each church and all the members of it are bound to pray continually for the good and prosperity of all the churches of Christ in all places and upon all occasions to further everyone within the bounds of their places and callings and the exercise of their gifts and graces, so the churches, when planted by the providence of God, so as they may enjoy opportunity, they, who's they? The churches, they may enjoy opportunity and advantage for it, ought to hold communion among themselves for their peace, increase of love, and mutual edification. Our confession knows nothing of individual people belonging to its association. So when I hear of groups that allow individual members of churches to become members of its association and then call themselves associational and then call themselves confessional, I have to ask, is it really? That's not what our confession holds, right? Now, even greater than that, that's not what we believe the Bible teaches. The Bible does not teach free-range Christianity, kind of like your free-range chicken that just wanders out there, all right? And you're in the kingdom, but you're not in a local church, okay? There is a high view of ecclesiology that our confession, our tradition, and the scripture itself holds, right? Christians are to be members of churches, period, all right? And those churches are to be connected to other churches of like faith and order, all right? Okay, comments, questions, thoughts on that? Yeah, Tom? Oh, yeah. It is often personalities and programs that bring people to churches. And when people would then get connected to churches because of personalities and programs, when those programs change or those personalities change, people leave, right? Be committed to the Word of God. Be committed to sound doctrine. And if that church moves its commitment away from the Word of God and moves its doctrine and shifts and will not listen to some kind of correction, well, that may be a good time to leave. But personalities and programs, they're no good reason to join a church, and they're no good reason to leave one. And so I think our unions need to reflect that. And so, all right, a third thing, and we'll wrap up with this one here. Our unions must be regularly renewed and kept accountable to the foundation of truth upon which they are grounded. This is one of the things that the Baptist Union, was not doing very well over the years. Now, one of the things that made it easier for them to kind of weaken this accountability is they continued to change their doctrinal standard. We talk about moving the goalposts today or whatever, all right? In the early 19th century, the doctrinal standard was the Second London Confession. 20 years later, it was evangelical commitments. 35 years later, it was baptism. And by 1888, when they made that the declaration that we looked at last time, they gave a nod at committing themselves to the evangelical statement again. But then what they gave with this hand, they took away with this other, saying that, well, we do have churches that don't affirm these things and don't really believe this, and it's okay. It'll be fine. So what I borrowed the text here out of our own confession in paragraph 15. In cases of difficulties or differences, that's kind of tiny print, sorry about that, either in point of doctrine or administration, wherein either the churches in general are concerned or any one church in their peace, union, and edification, or any member or members of any church are injured in or by any proceedings and censures not agreeable to truth and order, it is according to the mind of Christ that many churches holding communion together do by their messengers meet to consider and give their advice in or about the matter in difference, to be reported to all the churches concerned. Howbeit, these messengers assembled are not entrusted with any church power properly so called, or with any jurisdiction over the churches themselves to exercise any censures either over any churches or persons, or to impose their determination on the churches or officers. And just to kind of start with that last statement there, the messengers that get together are not entrusted with church power properly so called. No church in the association could be excommunicated by the messengers that had assembled. We could not declare you to be a non-church. We could not declare you to be, an unbeliever. We can't excommunicate you from the association. However, we can remove, and our associations often talk about this, we can remove what's called conscientious commendation. We can say that because your church has veered from the truth that we confess to such an extent, you no longer affirm our confession of faith, we can remove from you conscientious commendation, which would effectively remove you from the association of churches. But this entire idea of getting together with your messengers to help settle matters, notice the opening line, points of doctrine or administration. Something's gone amiss in one of our churches, all right? We have to be able to get together by our messengers and talk about this issue and make a decision on what to do. But it's all based upon the idea that we share a common what? We share a common doctrine, right? Because if we don't share some common doctrine, then we just kind of get together and say, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? What do you want to do? And now it's everybody's kind of opinion about what to do. We're not assessing a church by virtue of a common standard. And so our unions must regularly be renewed and kept accountable. For example, every year, I think they still do this, I'm just kind of wondering now. I believe for a while at least in CBA, we sent out like a yearly letter. And I think it's part of the package that they send out each year before the associational meeting. That's a statement. Does your church still fully subscribe the confession of faith as your confession? And I can sign it and send it back and say yes. So there's some kind of accountability with that. And if your union doesn't have that regular accountability, then it's destined to fall off, right? I mean, just the presence of human sin ensures that we're gonna weaken in our doctrinal commitments or even our practice, our affirmations. And so there needs to be a continual renewal and accountability in our associations. Tom.
I remember in the 20 days of RBC,
Mm-hmm.
confessional,
Mm-hmm.
that's what not. Not a
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Andrew?
This is touches on. I heard Matthew Barrett, Baptist, and Baptist, Baptist. I heard a snippet of a talk that he gave where he said that most likely Baptists would disagree. Part of the Nicene baptism. That's not what I'm asking you about, though. But my question is about the next thing, which is more than even if they agree with the content, Baptists, if they had been there, their modern theology, have to disagree with its conciliar authority as such, the fact that it was a council.
Right.
What would Baptists say about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw the clip, and then I went and watched a bigger portion of the clip from his actual lecture that he was giving at was this like to Anglican students? I think it may have been like to students, like college students. I'm not sure. Anyway, I saw part of the clip. And he's taking that from the idea that Anglicanism espouses the leadership of bishops, all right? It's an episcopal form of government. And so what he's saying is in the 4th century, episcopacy was prevalent in the churches, and the area bishops would come, and they were the ones that actually spoke in 325 at the council, all right? I believe in bishops too. Just not the kind he does. We don't have on the bulletin, in front of my name and Ryan's name, Bishop Jason, Bishop Ryan, all right? But technically speaking, by the scripture, we hold the office of bishop, all right? It's just bishop as it would have been in the New Testament, and in the 2nd century, up toward the very end, a bishop of a local church, all right? So I think what Barrett doesn't understand, I think what he assumes he understands is Baptist ecclesiology and local church autonomy. We are not espousing local church independency. Whenever we get together in our associational meetings by our messengers, we're doing what they did in Acts chapter 15 which is the very kind of text in the New Testament that Anglicanism goes back to say, this is the idea of bishops. But if you go back to Acts chapter 15, it wasn't just area bishops that were talking in Acts 15 about the justification controversy. It was the elders of the church in Jerusalem. It was the apostles. And most likely, I think a case could be made that there were elders represented of varieties of churches in Judea, unless we think that there was only like one church in Judea. There was one church in Jerusalem, but there were probably multiple churches in Judea. And so you have Judean elders, you have the elders of the church in Jerusalem, and you have the apostles. And then it says it seemed good to us. And it doesn't just mean it seems good to Peter and James. It seems good to all of us together. And it even involves the congregation in that final decision. And they go and admonish these other churches. So I think, and what's interesting, you mentioned that Matthew Barrett's a Reformed Baptist. And that may be, or was, it may be. The church that he was a part of in Kansas City was associational insofar as it participated in the Southern Baptist Convention. So I don't want to draw from that necessarily that he's full-blown historic Baptist associational, right? And I don't think he really understands Baptist ecclesiology because Baptist associationalism is, we're not rejecting bishops. In fact, our own confession refers to the pastoral office as a bishop. It uses that language, all right? You understand the idea of the terms in Scripture, poimen, a shepherd, episkopos, which is an overseer, which is the word we translate sometimes as bishop, or presbyteros, who is the presbyter, or sometimes translated elder, all right? A pastor, an elder, a bishop. They're all the same person, same office, all right? And so I think it's probably a little disingenuous of Barrett to say what he said. It's a token bone to the audience that he's speaking to, Anglicanism. And as if what he's really trying to say is, I'm one of you now. I'm not those guys anymore. So anyway.
But do you, to the point though, that he was stating, do you disagree? Do you think that Baptist ecclesiology could affirm the existence of Nicaea?
Absolutely.
Not just the content of it, but the act of coming together for that purpose.
If Baptists were there in the 4th century, which they weren't, unless I'm a successionist or a landmarker, all right, saying that the only true church is the Baptist church and Baptists were there, all right? And it's always funny, though, those Baptist successionists, the kind of people that Baptist successionists want to associate with in the 4th century aren't going to be the people that are at Nicaea. They're probably going to be almost like the Arians or the Donatists or the Novatian, whatever, different kind of groups that kind of veer off of that established church type thing. But if Baptists were there in the 4th century, we probably would have had some contentions about ecclesiology and the way this kind of played out. But even if I disagree with the idea of an area bishop is still a what? He's still a bishop. He's still a pastor. He's still an elder. He's still a shepherd, all right? And that ecclesiology in the 4th century was beginning to get confused in the latter part of the 2nd century. So that confusion had been around some time. So if Barrett's going to say that we're going to reject what happens there just because of the governmental structure, we're probably going to have to reject a lot of things from the patristic period. I think we can affirm them getting together. We can affirm the work and the way it was, the work that was done, the outcome, even though we might say it was done in a disorderly type way. Okay? It's not the way we would do it, granted. But that doesn't mean that we throw the whole thing out. Presbyterians get together today, all right, and do all kinds of stuff. But we don't unchurch the Presbyterians. I don't want to unchurch the 4th century church.
In other words, you think that Baptists could have come together to decide the things that were decided at Nicaea. They would have done it differently, but they could have come together to
Yes, yes, absolutely. If we had in the 4th century, I don't know, let's just imagine, since we're being hypothetical, let's imagine that every church in the 4th century is a Baptist church, all right? Which that's what the secessionists would say, all right? All the true churches were Baptist churches. How would they have done something like this? They would have done it by 2614 and 15. They would have gotten together with their messengers, and they would have made a doctrinal decision. And they would have sent it out to the churches. And churches that didn't want to stand with this, they would not give them conscientious commendation. And they would, associationalism is, in a sense, kind of what happened, it's just on a much smaller scale. And so, yeah. Paul, real quick, we're going to have to break.
That was what I was also.
Yeah.
He recognizes that we have the confession, which had to come about some.
Yeah, and if you really go study the Second London, the Savoy, the Westminster Confession, their indebtedness to those 4th century creeds is great. And much of the language in the 4th and 5th century from Chalcedon and Athanasian Creed, the Nicene Creed, comes into our own confessional tradition. All right, good discussion there, and I'd say if you got lost on that, go watch the clip by Matthew Barrett, but I don't know, don't waste your time. And yes, I think we can rightly and positively affirm those conciliar type decisions on the creeds. Gladly so, and I'm thankful for it. And so.